Howdy, everyone. Welcome to the latest version of the Crisis of Confidence podcast series. So, last session, we actually talked about sort of the biggest issue or most talked about, not the biggest issue, the most talked about issue in terms of things that affect data quality. So, this one, we're going to actually talk about data quality issues not directly related to fraud. And I think one of the most controversial things I've said, and I truly believe this, is that if somehow we were able to eliminate all fraud in the industry, we would still have a data quality issue that would be leading people to question the data, question everything we've got. The other thing that I want to put out there is that we will be dividing this particular topic into two different sessions. I thought about going all the way through, but it's going to be a long recording. So, it was good enough for Wicked. It was good enough for the Hunger Games. So we're going to do parts one and part two. Part one will cover what our special guests have to say, sort of a framework that'll set us up for part two. And then part two will take us all the way through the end. The second thing that I want to point out, we're going to be talking mostly about online survey and market research. Everything we're saying, and I will bring in telephone and other modalities as we go through. Now, it's slightly different. So, whereas people are trying to qualify for surveys when they belong to panels, uh, if you've seen it, people are trying not to take surveys when you reach them by telephone or in person. So the principles are the same. There is still a data quality concern that we actually have. Um, I'm going to tell some stories. One of my most meaningful things I've done or seen in the telephone space lately, the New York Times, and I apologize, I can't remember if it was the 2016 election. I think it was the 2018 congressional and midterm elections. They actually did a wonderful thing. They put their telephone center um, dispositions live on their website. And it was fascinating just to watch it. And if you questioned whether there were data quality issues on telephone, if you watched that, you had no doubt that there were. Um, it was less than 1% of the sample they were trying to reach out to actually took the call. You could even see if somebody picked up and hung up. And it wasn't that they couldn't reach people necessarily. It was that people just wouldn't take the surveys. Um, so we'll go on again just because of some overarching concerns. The majority of what we talk about will be online. So I put together a framework when I started working with the global data quality initiatives. And really, the way that I started thinking about this is, we have a data quality issue. The first one is what everyone talks about, fraud. That's not the only thing affecting data quality. Uh, it's important. We need to solve for it. If you saw my session last time, I think we've got some good solutions in place. We've got vendors that are attacking the problem. We do need the entire ecosystem to embrace the technology that we're bringing to bear. I think AI brings us some new solutions in this space. Strangely enough, I think, while I don't think we'll ever eliminate fraud, I do think that we're able to attack it and put solutions into place. And so that was always the first prong of those things affecting data quality. The second is suboptimal behavior respondents. That is not outright fraud. These are folks who, from time to time, give us data or answer surveys in ways that don't give us meaningful information, aren't the right answers. They get tired during the survey. We'll come back to examples of each of these. And then the third one that people want to deflect from, and I've seen this in discussions we've had, is bad survey research practices and methodologies. We're actually inducing a lot of the bad behavior that we're actually seeing within surveys. The way that we're going about things um, can be rectified. So I've heard people say we're not putting solutions out there. I think there are solutions for all of these. Now, is it perfect? No. But as we've said time and time again, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay, so some examples of fraud. One we actually have an absolute solution for is ghost completes. These are things, if you heard my last session, that people don't even take the survey. They just go to the end link and they pretend that they have. These people kind of have not concentrated on ghost completes, although the Global Data Quality Initiative has, in fact, issued some guidelines here. We know how to solve it. Some companies won't put the solution into place, and this is confusing to me. It only saves them money. It just leads to higher quality data if we do this. AI generated responses, algorithmic responses, or bots. People masking identity, and usually it's in combination with one of the other ones. Taking surveys multiple times, inaccurate answers to screening questions in an attempt to qualify, and intentionally taking surveys on different accounts to try and generate more incentives and work through it. These are all well known. These are things we talk about day to day. These are not the only examples of fraud. In all these cases, these are just some examples. Um, but these we can go down the list and come up with solutions. So when we talk about suboptimal behavior, and I want to give Randy Thomas a shout out, he's the one who came up with the idea of suboptimal behavior. These are respondents who are coming into surveys and they're speeding. They're straight lining, or really people are smart enough not to straight line if they see a grid that they hate. So it's inattentive response patterns, things of that nature. It's low quality, gibberish, open ends, although people are using AI for open ends, and there's a big debate within the industry as to whether this is fraud, suboptimal behavior, or it's acceptable. I have a really pointed opinion on this, which is, if people are giving you answers and they're just refining their answers via AI, it's actually a good answer. Uh, I taught at the University of Chicago for a bit, and one of the things about the University of Chicago is a very international group of students. I had students from all over the world, and they're taking classes and things that are not their first language. And, we allowed them to use AI where they could write out whatever they were trying to respond to, not on tests, but they could go out and they could write it in the language that they think in, put it through AI, and then get it into a good form that they could turn in. Now, at the end of the day, they were responsible for what they turned in, but you got higher quality work. I'm convinced by allowing them to do that. So open ends, if they're getting the inputs into a chat GPT and just putting the outputs in there, then that's not fraud. That's not bad responses. That's actually enhancing the quality of the survey. So on the other hand, if they're not putting any thought into what they're putting into ChatGPT or whatever LLM is generating the response for open ends, that is fraud and potentially, or it's suboptimal behavior. So it's all contextual. Attention check failures. I hate attention check. These are also known as red herring questions. Research after research has shown that those are catching good respondents who don't understand what the question is asking, as opposed to those who are, responding in bad faith for that. Mismatched answers, choosing fewer items, trying, to game the system here. They think they're actually helping. Again, the intent is not necessarily bad in all of these. And then here are some elements of bad survey practices, and we'll talk about all of these or a lot of these. Incentives that do not match the effort given. We'll talk a lot about this. Misidentifying the population of interest, poor survey design practices, you know, bouncing folks across surveys, not giving them credit for it, multi-barreled questions, asking surveys that are too long, poor poor results on the back end, misinterpretation of results. All of those are just some of the elements on it. I do want to talk about a few things. Some of our guests will do that as well. I do think that we need to think about surveys from the respondent point of view. You know, we have all these rules. We have rules that sort of govern what we do. Everyone's heard length of interview, and the established length of interview, preferred length of interview, has come down and down and down. Frank Kelly, who's one of our guests this week, and I did some research a few years back. I wish we'd done more with it. We presented it at a conference, but it was really stunning research. Length of interview only matters if they're only going into one survey. We only measure length of interview from the final survey that the respondent has taken. And we don't consider all the entities, all the time they've spent in the system. And from that reason, you know, if they've taken a 10-minute survey, but they've really spent 40 minutes trying to get to that 10-minute survey, their behavior is as if they've taken a 40-minute survey. The work that Frank and I did, and I'll talk more about this in part two. What was fascinating about it is, A, we proved that incentives work, and they work in the same way we've always known them to work. Two, we know that folks want more incentives, more, you know, it's not even proportional. And so we did a choice exercise. And what we found out was, as long as they're getting more, they're willing to take more. They're willing to put more time into a survey. Now, this is into the environment, and there is a limit. But, you know, the example I give is if you were going to give 100 points, or baseline is 100 for a 5-minute survey, they'd be willing to take a 10-minute survey for 150 points. So not even double, not even in proportion to that. They just want more points in this world. So length of interview, we were able to show length of interview. Still, you can do longer, you know, 15-minute surveys if you're controlling the environment that they're in, and they're not taking survey after survey just to qualify surveys. So I already jumped to this page, but our two guests this week are Frank Kelly and Gina Pingitore. Two just wonderful, wonderful human beings who have been around the industry forever. Frank is currently the market research practice lead at Virtual Incentives. He had various leadership, SVP, and above roles at Ipsos involving panels and research. He was the SVP of various things, panels, marketing, and strategy at Lightspeed and Kantar. He's been at TNS. He was at Greenfield. I think everybody at some point was at Greenfield or one of Greenfield's a company that came from Greenfield. So, for example, I was at Taluna, which subsumed Greenfield when Greenfield was sold to Microsoft. He's at AC Nielsen, Colgate, Palmolive. Frank has been around the industry forever. I don't want to make him sound old, but he has done everything. He's done a ton of serious research. You know, if you know this space, you know Frank. When he says something, it's got a lot of research behind it. It's not said willy-nilly. It's not said just to say it. His section, which I give folks the option of recording something and sending it in, or interviewing. And each of the 2 weeks I've done this, the one has chosen one, the other has chosen the other. So Frank is pre-recorded his, and I think he brings up several really interesting things that we need to think about. And he makes one of my points, which is there are certain things we used to do better before, and we need to go back to them in order to find solutions. The second is Gina Pingitore. She as is Frank, is a dear friend of mine. She's currently consulting within the industry. She's been the head of research at Facebook apps at Meta. She was the SVP of Research and Innovation in MPD. She works with some wonderful people there. She was the managing director of the research practice at Deloitte. And what she's most known for is she spent quite a bit of time as the chief research officer at JD Power. In addition to that, she's also a publicist and was an assistant professor in our time. Gina is phenomenal. We intended only to speak for 5 minutes. One of the reasons that I'm dividing this into two is we ended up speaking for way longer than that. She has some brilliant points that she brings out. Things that were creating data quality issues within the industry, all fixable. Well, she brings up one thing. She doesn't know if it's fixable, but I'll let you actually listen to her. But as I said, I don't edit what we're doing. I want you guys to see the whole conversation or what someone sent in, as that's their intent. Um, I always enjoyed chatting both with Frank and Gina. And to prove my point, they are both, along with the incredible Bob Fossen, are going to be talking about data quality concerns at the next MRC virtual meeting. So if you're either a member or you know somebody who's a member, get on that. That conversation will be fantastic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and we're going to listen to what both Frank and Gina have to say.
Hello, my name is Frank Kelly. I work as the MR practice lead at Regional Incentives. So it's my job to basically understand how to engage research respondents and how to motivate them to participate in market research. In my experience, there's a lot of focus right now on fraud, but there's still not enough attention paid to what respondents really want and how to motivate them to participate, which is another key driver of quality, as John, as I'm sure explained. We can't just look at getting rid of fraudsters. You have to also focus on how to motivate people to do the right behaviors, which is focusing and thinking about what needs to get done for you to have a successful research project. So some of the things I've been advocating for many years, I hate to say it this way, but 10, 15 years ago, we had some models that worked pretty well. We got away from them. Indeed, there was a time when we paid a lot more for incentives for participation in surveys. We paid for different things like just opening an email or for screening out. And we got away from all that. Some companies do pay a few cents for a screen out, but essentially the screen out process has got a lot worse, a lot more difficult, a lot more time consuming, and is essentially uncompensated time. I've done dozens of surveys with respondents across a number of countries, and the number one thing that always comes back with is they don't complain too much about the time they spend in the survey and the compensation for what they do there. Some think it could be a little higher, but for the most part, what really irritates the hell out of them is that there isn't often any compensation for the time they spend screening, that their time isn't considered valued on their end. They don't feel like there's a trust there because they're being asked the same questions repetitively when they know that there should be a way for that to be, that data to be saved and reused. So I think the simple process to solve this problem is not something that people want to do, but to say, look, we're going to define an hourly rate of what we're going to give you. Right now it's quite low, but it's going to be higher. We're consistently asking people more complex research activities. Video is becoming big now with conversational AI. There's a lot more data scraping coming along for different types of information, and so forth. And so if you can better compensate people, better tie their compensation to the activity that they're asking to perform. And that's the thing that people don't seem to appreciate, that almost every survey you ever see out there, every survey you ever see out there is the incentive level is associated strictly with one thing, the length of interview, LOI. And the reality is, though, that the cognitive load of one survey is a lot different than the cognitive load of another survey. Some have all kinds of things where they want you to, you know, brainstorm on this or reorder these or complex grids or talk to an AI agent or whatever. And those types of things you have to think a lot more than a simple multiple choice survey. And people know that. And there are people that just want a simple basic survey. There's others that are fine to do the more complex research, but they feel they should be compensated for it. But again, that comes back through and through all the surveys that I'm doing. People just want to have a fair deal, so take into effect the complexity of the survey exercise in the compensation level. Take into effect the privacy intrusions required. Some surveys, require you to have a video, and that people feel 85%, I think, of the people in my latest survey said they feel they should be compensated more for surveys that require video. Seems fair. Um, a lot of like 100% of the people said they should be compensated for ID validation, but companies rarely do. So essentially, what I'm advocating for is a movement from a very simplified, you know, here's your LOI, here, therefore, here's a 15-minute survey, so here's your 50 cents. To say, okay, well, this particular survey has a very high respondent burden. And that's a term that I think we need to think about more often. Respondent burden is really just how much thinking they have to do, how much privacy invasion they have to accept, except if they have to download something, they have to, be in a room and be visible. They can't be doing it on a bus, all those kinds of things. And the other thing that I forgot to mention there is the topic of the survey. We know very well there are some surveys that are really hard to answer. And I've been doing survey research on that and find that, some people, they'll be 5 times more interested in doing a survey on, say, politics right now is very popular, for example. Um, but would have a real, they really despise doing, a lot of people despise doing healthcare surveys or doing financial surveys, but they'll happy to do concept tests all day long or ad research. They like to look at ads. So you can tell by the completion rates, and the dropout rates and various things. You can tell which surveys people don't want to do, which ones they do want to do. Adjust the compensation accordingly so that you okay, this is a survey, maybe it's a tracker you've been running for a long time, it's always a hard one to fill. Okay, bump it up 50% and it'll fill because people just want to feel like it's a fair deal for what they're doing. So the whole industry right now is driven on a cost per click basis, right? All the companies supplying sample, they're looking at what is the cost for every click, and if this project isn't getting them the clicks that they want, they don't send traffic to them. I think you need to reverse that logic and say, if that's good way for companies to manage their traffic and where they're going to send people to, the reverse should also be true, not just on the revenue side, but on the incentivization side for your respondents and the retention is there should be a cost per completion percentage or some kind of metric we could come up with, which is tied to how willing people were to do that survey, how happy they were to do it, what percentage of people completed it that started it, whatever the metric might be. But there should be a new focus on that. And if you do that, I guarantee you the quality will rise dramatically in our industry because people feel fairly treated. And right now, respondents are complaining a lot. I've run, I say, dozens of surveys, and the open ends and the conversational AI surveys are all saying, they're doing it, but they're not enjoying it, and that's a problem. And I'd love to see us address that. Thank you very much.
And joining us today is Gina Pingitore. If you guys don't know Gina, first of all, you should. But one of the experts about everything in our field, and just a tremendously great person. So thank you for joining us. I really do appreciate it. Um, a lot of the talk today is about how data fraud um, will impact data quality.
Mhm.
I've made the assertion multiple times that if we solved all of the issues that are associated with data fraud, we'd still have a data quality issue. So, what do you agree with that? And secondly, if you do, we talked before, so I kind of know the answer to that. What other elements are you seeing that are impacting data quality these days?
Well, fraud is the headline.
Yeah,
Um, but the real story is what I like to think of as a messy pileup of a lot of factors that are in place even before any real fraud happens. Even before any bot or professional respondent takes a survey, there are data quality issues that the industry can and should fix. And I believe that those issues probably are more impactful and are likely even easier to
yeah,
solve than the fraud that hits the headlines. I'm not saying that fraud is not a problem. I do think the industry has taken it very seriously and have put in place to prevent, minimize actual fraud. But what the industry hasn't done is applied that same due diligence and effort to other things that really negatively impact, the quality of our data. And we
yeah.
could talk a little bit about what those factors are.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask you about. I think we probably could talk for hours on if we did the full list, but what are some of the things that you think are impacting the data the most?
Well, there's one issue, and the solution to this one problem is not really straightforward. We have a mismatch between supply and demand.
Hmm.
Right? You know, uh, if you look at the number of companies, even uh, companies and industries, academia, federal, individual brands, they want consumer feedback. So the demand is exponential. But when you look at the supply in the traditional way, traditional panels, are very hard to care, feed, and be profitable. So that mismatch between I want to hear from my consumers and the current supply of traditional flow of data is limited and
Yeah,
problematic. And what ends up happening is as those traditional supplies become more stressed, you get almost like professional respondents. They're real people, but they're now being tasked to do 20 surveys a week,
yeah,
some depending on their characteristics in what we call hard to reach groups are inundated. So the supply demand, equation needs to be addressed and addressed of maybe in more creative ways than currently happening. So that's one. The other two issues I think are easier for the industry, for buyers, for individual users of the data to really do something about. And the first one is return to basics in terms of what you ask, how you ask, and why you ask it. You know, I think one of the negative things about the advancements of tools and technology is it makes everyone think designing a survey is easy. I'll plug and chug, there's automatic tools, and the science of what we ask, why we ask, and how we organize the survey seems to have been thrown to the wayside.
yeah,
And I frequently hear people say, well, anybody can design a survey. Now, yeah, I'm biased, right? I've spent my entire career, involved in the science of measurement. There is an art, but scaling, order, um, and the principles that were, tried and tested in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Some of them have been forgotten. Some of them have, of course, needed to morph because in the 70s, we didn't have a device. We didn't have, you know, other channels by which consumers take surveys. So the length of the questions, the number of the words, how your answer options are displayed, when to randomize, when not to randomize. Those things seem to have been put on the wayside, and the do-it-yourself tools, although they're built to try to address best practices, they're maybe not applied as thoughtfully or as consistently
Mhm.
as needed. Our in our industry organizations like ESOMAR, the Insight Association, the MRC, academia, they've increasingly put out standards and criteria for what makes a good survey. On the practice side, particularly over the last decade, I see surveys through the clients I support or the organizations I've worked for, and I open it up and I say, who the heck wrote this? It's like you have these guidelines, you have these tools, and your output is a confusing, complicated, hard to answer survey. So those getting back to basics
Yeah.
is a critical, excuse me, is a critical one.
Yeah.
We can chat a little bit more about that, or we can talk about the other factor that's the other.
Well, let's get to the other factor in a second, but one of the things that I feel the same way. But I also think here we're talking primarily about online research. We do talk about telephone and other types of research elsewhere, but I think when online research was struggling for validity and struggling, to be taken seriously, which it no longer is. It's established. It's easily the primary form how people are doing research these days. There was a lot more attention to the detail. There was a lot
Right.
more. We got to do this right. Things that I think, the things that we discovered back then. My first paper wasn't on weighting, which I'm most known for. It was on the design and how you would
Right.
ask questions
I do
differently in
remember
this
that paper.
in these various things. We found that, using visual elements was often gave you a better measurement
Mhm.
than actually just replicating a telephone survey online. And I look and I take surveys these days, and I just don't see all the stuff that we knew in the past
Right.
being applied. And I do think there are several reasons. I think you got into some of it. I think one of the reasons, and I think this is a bit controversial, is if people have data on numbers on a piece of page on a page, some people just don't care, and that's really harsh in this way. And so, just being able to get to those numbers sometimes is the goal, not
Absolutely.
what do those numbers
Absolutely.
mean, and are these numbers accurate?
Well, to sort of underscore that, I had the privilege to be hired by and worked for a number of years for Dave Power. And one of his uh, messages to clients and to the industry is don't manage the score, manage the store.
Hmm.
And as organizations continue to put incentives, performance evaluation, a number of things on a number, you move away from the real purpose of getting feedback. You want feedback to tell you how you're doing, how to make improvements. You're not getting the feedback to get a number to compensate. And I think that there is that delicate balance. I'm not saying that, numbers don't matter in terms of a balanced scorecard in a company, but when the focus is just on a number, you sort of forget why are we asking these questions and what are we actually doing?
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
and
going to throw you a curveball. This isn't something we've talked about.
okay.
And this is for an episode, 2 or 3 episodes down the road. You mentioned sort of coming up in an organization that was led by somebody who knew what he was doing in the research space.
Hmm.
Um, I had the same experience, with Gordon Black, with Humphrey Taylor, with Todd Johnson. If you take them out of the CEO or chairman role, they
Hmm.
could easily be an analyst or a data scientist in the company and just be brilliant. They created new things. That's not really the model these days. Again, another assertion that
Right.
people can push back on, but I've had the experience of working with people who had never had any research experience before they
Right.
got the CEO role, and the way they look at things are different. Um, you know, sorry, this is not the most insightful question, but have you seen the same thing, or it's not
Yeah, absolutely.
completely.
Absolutely. I perhaps I'm getting a little jaded, but I think the insight industry um, is being led by folks whose purpose is revenue.
Mhm.
The primary purpose is I want insight to help companies,
Yeah.
businesses grow. And I'll quote Dave again, is the job is to help you to use information to help companies grow responsibly.
Look, there's nothing wrong with wanting to generate revenue.
No, absolutely.
Todd,
Absolutely.
who I mentioned, extraordinarily successful. All of them were to some degree extraordinarily successful, but I think the way they thought about it and the way that they, was to be a trusted source and therefore grow the business by everyone wanting to work with you and work with your data.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I think the framing was, and I give you data in a timely fashion, is I give you answers to the questions you need to run your business.
exactly, exactly.
And I think we've moved away from that. And, I am not casting blame or even making any connection between the digital and automation. These things are great, but an unintended consequence is we can do it faster and we will generate a number. We have not necessarily thought, can I do it faster and generate more insight? I think you would agree with me. We've talked about this, I think, over the years we've known each other, and I think the issue is now even more magnified. Companies are data rich
Yeah.
and increasingly insight poor. Uh,
Amen. That's absolutely the case. Hey, I told you I'd only take 5 minutes of your time. We've gone well over that. And as you
yes.
know, I don't edit out things, so
Uh,
we're gonna play the whole thing. The third point that you wanted to make, I
Well, I
want to give
think
you the
there's,
opportunity.
and I'm sure, you have talked to others. I've had the privilege of chatting with Frank, and I know he was on one of your earlier podcasts. But I think it's an issue that we need to revisit, and that is, our incentive structure.
Yep,
If you take all the things together, supply and demand pressures, moving away from the basics and good survey design, and then you think about how are we caring and feeding the people who are taking our surveys? And the incentive structure needs to be thought through. You know, Decades ago, I guess I'm old and sound like my parents, but decades ago, built into the execution of insight, whether it's market insight, healthcare insight, was the notion that you have to give a balanced reward to whomever you're engaging with.
yep,
And it's a combination of extrinsic reward, meaning the actual monetary incentive or points incentive, and an intrinsic reward,
correct.
right? We forget that people will tell, like, I'm not being compensated for this. We're having a lengthy conversation because I'm intrinsically rewarded by this dialogue. Our consumers aren't. We're giving them pennies for lengthy, complicated surveys, and they walk away with, what did I get for this?
So it's interesting you mentioned that. One of the first works I did on incentives was really on more of the intrinsic value as opposed because everyone knows people want the value, the monetary value. But we found a lot of usefulness in giving people information,
Right.
telling them how their data was ultimately going to be used. Now, there's a you can only go so far because some of it is used for proprietary purposes. But even in those surveys, we forced our clients to actually put something we could feed back to the respondents. And
Right.
at the end of the day, they really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
mean like immediate feedback on your answers will do X, but somewhere communicate that the information you're collecting for
yep,
consumers changed something. Like, you fly an airline. I do surveys. I shouldn't do this too often because maybe I'll get even more inundated with surveys. But every time I fly, whoever airline, I get a survey. I will I will complete it. I don't know how many times I've told United, stop giving me the banana pudding because it is terrible. I don't get the banana pudding is still there. There's nothing on the website that
yep,
says what they do with the information. Just something that reminds the not reminds, but tells your consumer, what are you doing with all the
yep.
information that is collected? I mean,
Well,
that's
we used to send out information. It wasn't even, we did actually have an instant feedback thing, but we would
Mhm.
actually send out to those folks, an update on their data was used for this, and
Mhm.
that was really what was most appreciated in that world. And our ecosystem's different. It would be much
Right.
more difficult to do that across multiple providers, but if you could, there's some sense to that and some,
Right.
reward to the respondent who is or the participant who's giving of their time to actually help us.
That's right. I mean, it's like you ask me questions, but you're not listening or taking any
Yeah.
action. Particularly for brands that do tracking studies. They do tracking study year after year after
Don't
year.
even get me started on tracking studies. People who get mad that their data changed. Well, we looked through it. It did change. I can't change. Well, then why did you do the tracking study if
Yeah,
you
why are
didn't
you
want it to
tracking?
change? It's
Exactly.
fun. It's
Well,
fun. Well, Gina,
this
I
was
really
fun.
do appreciate it, and it's no surprise to anyone we've been friends for a good number of years, and I really do appreciate your insight, and
Well, I
I
appreciate
even
the
more so
opportunity.
appreciate your friendship.
Well, back at you, John, and uh,
Woohoo!
I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to talking to with you again.
Talk to you later. Bye
Bye.
bye. Well, I think there was a lot there. As I said, we're breaking this into two. So the next session, we'll review what we heard, what we talked about, and then I'm going to take it forward from there. Um, I was gonna just do this as one session and just tell you if you didn't have the time, just do the intro and the two speakers. But I do think it's important to analyze where we're at, where we're going. So in the next day or two, I will drop the second session on this one. But the one thing I want you to take away is we have solutions. I think people feel a little bit chastened, a little bit concerned that we've got all this stuff happening in the industry, but we don't have solutions. We have solutions. I think we'll go over exactly what they are. And it's as important as protocols. Technical as protocols. And it's as easy as, we understood a lot of this stuff early on, particularly in the online space where we were fighting for um, recognition. We were fighting to do good work. As you heard me talk with Gina, my very first paper in this space had nothing to do with sampling and weighting, which is what I'm known for. It had to do with design, how you construct a survey, how you think about it in the online space. So we had solutions. I think we've lost that. And I think the expertise, both in the world of telephone, in the world of face to face, and the world of online, we've lost a little bit of that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that expertise has its place, and we need to go back to the types of things we were doing before. Anyways, the next day or two, we'll drop the second session on this one. As I said, I didn't want this to run too long. It could have run well over an hour. And my YouTube analytics say you guys don't like things that are that long. So we understand that. And as I said, we'll break it into two. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.